This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 474, Revolt Event Loop. On today's show, we're talking about the Revolt Event Loop, what it is, and why it matters, with guest Alexander Varfag. We'll also cover IEF Complex Widget Dialog as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Alexander Varfag. Alexander is technical architect at OpenSocial, where he uses his over 12 years of Drupal experience to provide teams with guidance of how best to leverage Drupal and its ecosystem, and to point out when Drupal may not be the right solution. Thank you for doing that. In his spare time, he enjoys gaming, cycling, watching Formula One, and reading books on programming, business, finance, and mental well-being. He's currently getting Drupal core to adopt the Revolt event loop, which we are going to talk about today. Alexander, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think I might have asked you this the last time, but favorite Formula One driver?
It's still Max Verstappen.
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
like-
that's what I thought.
I gotta support the Dutch flag.
I didn't want to misrepresent. Got it. Yeah. So Formula One is interesting. They started doing it in the United States now. They did it in Vegas. They're like doing it a couple of times, I guess. Although people were kind of like on the Vegas race, but we could have a whole other show about that, I suppose.
That is a separate episode for sure. Yeah.
We got to get Formula One on Drupal. That'd be pretty awesome, right?
Are they not already?
Oh, maybe they are. Maybe I'm behind the times in the latest Drupal websites. I don't know.
I just assume every large media site at this point is running Drupal. So.
Oh, I like that. Maybe I'll start doing that myself. Thanks. I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the next 4 weeks. Josh Mitchell, founder and principal consultant at M6L. Josh has led teams in digital agencies, governments, educational institutions, and nonprofits, including some time as CTO of the Drupal Association, and is currently the founder and principal consultant of M6L. As a full stack consultant, a typical day could include pair programming with a developer, advising a product manager, presenting to organizational leadership, or reviewing merge requests, and much more. Josh, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Listeners, you may remember Josh when he was CTO of the Drupal Association. He joined us quite a few, I think Nick said 350-ish episodes ago. So welcome back, and we'll try to get you on again before the next 350 go by. Last but certainly not least, joining us today, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. What's going on?
Not too much. Happy to be here. Looking forward to hearing about our module of the week.
Yeah, it's got a long title. Let's jump right into that. And now to bring our module of the week to us, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to use inline entity forms, but have the dependent form open in dialog? There's a module for that. It's called IEF Complex Widget Dialog, and it was created in March of 2020 by DataWeb. The recent releases are by Chris Lai, aka Chris CK, a fellow Canadian. It has 2.1.1 and 2.2.2 versions available, the latter of which is compatible with Drupal 8.8 or newer, all the way up to Drupal 11. It is actively maintained. In fact, the most recent release was in the past month. And in terms of issues open, it has 4 open issues, none of which are bugs against the current version. It does have 273 sites using it, according to Drupal.org. And really, when you install the module, your inline entity form widget configuration form will have a new checkbox to enable pop-up for IEF. Now, it includes specialized handling for different kinds of entities like nodes, users, taxonomy terms, and users. And it will handle not just the creation forms, but also editing existing entities, as well as duplicating or deleting entities. Now, this is probably not something you would always need, but it can be very useful if the form you want to use for entity or even the parent forms are very complex. I should also add that IEF itself supports form modes. So often when I'm working with IEF, I will create some kind of an embedded form mode that exposes fewer elements. For example, hiding the fields for URL alias, sticky, and so on. So personally, I would start there. But if the content creation experience still feels complex, then IEF complex widget dialog would be a nice way to help out your content creators. So let's talk about the module.
I feel like this is particularly isn't like the genesis of inline entity forms from commerce, right? I feel like this is where that's particularly useful if you're having like a manual collection page or something where you're creating a bunch of content.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it originally had to do, well, you're right, in commerce where you had to add, you kind of had to add different variations to a product. So then you could be on the product page and just open the form in a pop-up basically and add those variations without having to go through like different pages.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really useful. And then I think the other place that I see this happening quite a bit is when you have like team pages on organizations. Like sometimes it feels like overkill to just have a full, like having to go to an individual page when it's just really for a listing. But if you kind of have that embedded, that's helpful. I, I, the thing I really like about these types of modules is it makes these type of embedded relationships cleaner. Like I generally try to avoid them where possible because they're so complex. But if this works like the new paragraph like modal system works, I think it's a much better experience and actually might make exposing those relationships a little bit cleaner for clients.
Yeah, I think another place where this is really helpful, and I'll have to actually look to see if my dev team is actually using this. But when you're using layout builder and you're building out kind of complex block components, sometimes those blocks have other things inside them, other entities inside them, and this could be useful for creating and managing those as well. So yeah, definitely a great kind of user interface solution here, I think.
Whenever I saw it, I immediately thought of a council document solution that I built for City of Portland. And you have these weekly council meetings that have sessions, and then they have agendas, and then in each agenda item you're associating a document. Well, the only part of that is a content object is your overall council meeting and your deepest document layer, but all those other layers are just kind of glue that hold everything together. So this would be awesome for popping up non-content entities. Martin, your storage module, I could see like pulling up a storage entity and having a little bit more complex form where you've got some more metadata that you're tying everything together with. So really cool.
Just out of curiosity, would this work with like a complex media item too? Like if you had multiple fields on a media entity for some reason, like could you use this as a, not as a replacement for the media library, but like a special field for that?
Yep, just have to enable that as your widget, I guess.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to just quickly mention, Nick, you called out, the relationship to commerce. I feel like in some ways in the Drupal ecosystem, Drupal commerce is a bit like the space race. I feel like there are a bunch of very pervasive technologies that we have today, things like Velcro, that really owe their origin to the development of the space race. And I feel like a lot of things in Drupal, in the same way, address, inline entity form, really came out of the needs to create a good commerce experience.
I literally, when you first said that, thought you were attributing Velcro to Drupal commerce, and I was like, "Wait, what?" I'm like, "What library is this? I'm not familiar with the Velcro module. What does it do?" I'm with you now, and yeah, as somebody who
That's a great
really
point.
really loves Drupal commerce, like I do agree, a lot of great stuff has come out of there. Another thing that comes to mind is the address handling in both the
Yeah.
address module and in Drupal. Yeah, I think that was a big part of commerce.
So I have one question, Martin, and I think the answer is no. But you mentioned form modes, and I feel like one of the nice things that a module like this could provide, and I recognize that this is probably complex, but I feel like sometimes when you're editing inline content like that, you you're editing different things. So it'd be great if you could like open the dialogue with a different form mode, like maybe like a compact versus like if you're just trying to change the title or something else, or like maybe just open it. It's got 2 or 3 fields, but if you really need a deeper one, I mean, I guess you could just go back to the page, but that kind of defeats the purpose. Like it'd be nice to be able to open a different form mode depending on what you're trying to do with that content. Does this support that? I imagine no.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, theoretically, it's probably something that could be supported. I think it does expose some different sort of entity actions. So I'm not sure if it does it in a drop button or as discrete actions, but either way, in theory, there could be, you know, multiple ones created if there are multiple form modes available. But I haven't seen any evidence in the configuration so far of it really being able to support that. I will say I have actually done that with a different module, add content by bundle, which I use for like if I have a view of any content type to basically have a button at the top of that that says, you know, create one of these. So if it's a listing of events, have a button to create a new event, or if it's a blog to say, you know,
Oh
at the
yeah.
top, create a new blog post. You can specify form modes with that one. And so I've done that where I'll have a quick add. So it's like I've got a listing of events. If I just want to put in like the title and the date and time, I can press that one and get a really nice small form. Or I have a separate button that will point to the full form if I have, you know, like maybe it's a past event and there's a video recording and some other pieces that I want to populate. So there are options, and yeah, that could be a nice addition for, you know, the future of this module, I would say.
Martin, I don't know if you know this, but there's I believe a cat on the couch behind you.
That's actually a small dog. So
it was a 50-50. I couldn't really tell. I was like, it looks kind of like a dog, but it could be
No.
a cat. Anyway, I apologize to your doggo for calling it a cat. All right. Well, Martin, thank you for bringing us another wonderful module of the week. I'm sure, I know at least a couple of people on this panel are going to go out and try to use it right away. I'm sure our listeners will do the same. If folks wanted to connect, suggest a module, how could they go about doing that?
we are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot, Martin.
See you next week.
Hey, listeners, New England Drupal Camp is happening in Providence, Rhode Island on November 15th and 16th. The 15th features a full day higher ed summit, full and half day trainings, a contrib day where Drupal CMS track leads will be working on the next great Drupal build. All capped off on the 15th there with a community social where everybody can get together, play some pool, have some food, and enjoy talking about more Drupal stuff. Then on the 16th, we're doing a full day of sessions, which this year features a design track. Thanks to our friends at Design for Drupal, we've actually worked with them to develop a full day of design talks and design thinking. So that's going to be awesome. And the 16th also includes a keynote by Karen McGran and Jeff Eaton. You might remember Jeff. He used to be around the Drupal community. Also used to host some great trivia. He won't be doing that at New England Drupal Camp, but maybe you can ask him some trivia questions of your own. That day will all be capped off with an after party where, again, you get to talk Drupal over some drinks and some eats. It's going to be a good time. Nick, myself, Stephen Cross will be there. I think even Martin's gonna join us in Providence. So we hope to see everybody on November 15th and 16th in Providence, Rhode Island. You can find out more at nedcamp.org. Nominations for the 2025 Aaron Winborn Award are now open. You can head to Drupal.org and find out more information there on where to submit your nominations. And we will have that link in the show notes for you. The Aaron Winborn Award recognizes someone in the community who embodies service, integrity, and kindness. All of those things I like to think that I personally embody myself. But it's a great award. We've had previous winners on the show, and you can now nominate somebody for the 2025 award, which will be given out at DrupalCon in Atlanta. So head over to Drupal.org and get those nominations in. All right, let's move on to our primary topic. So we are talking about the Revolt event loop, which I know absolutely nothing about. So, Alexander, I'm going to give you the first question of explaining what the event loop is and why I should care about it.
Cool. Yeah, so let's change that today. So the event loop solves a problem that we have, or a limitation that we have in PHP, which is that the applications that we built in PHP really are synchronous code, where one thing needs to happen after another, and only then the next thing can happen. There are ways within PHP to do asynchronous things, but there's really no way to orchestrate that. So what an event loop provides you with is a way to orchestrate asynchronous tasks or tasks that can happen in different order. For me, the go-to example is always Node.js, which basically took JavaScript as a language and wrapped an event loop around that. And the way to use it is you think to do some task where you can say, for example, with Guzzle at the moment within PHP, you make a request, and rather than waiting for that to be done, you would give it to the event loop and say, okay, well, try to do this. As long as it's not done, do other things, and then when it's done, come back to me.
So it's like a queuing service, basically?
Basically, yeah. So an event loop allows you to go through these things. So the oldest event loop implementation that I've found, or actually, no, sorry, let me rephrase that. PHP itself has an event loop implementation that's older than Node.js, which is always interesting because Node.js has become popular with it. PHP hasn't. And what that also allows to do is it's basically an extension for PHP that's quite widely available. And it allows you to do things with sockets. So you could say, if I have a persistent PHP application that gets connections to that application, then that event loop could handle the socket connections and call your own PHP code when it's done. And that is actually quite complex. And there's quite a few or there's about 4 of those extensions available for PHP, some of which your host might have, some your host might not have. And what the Revolt event loop is a library that abstracts that away from us. So it'll automatically select the best available extension for us. It'll give us a PHP fallback implementation if none of those extensions are available. And then it provides us with a userland, so a PHP API that we can use to schedule our to schedule those tasks that we need to happen.
Okay. So let me see if I got this before Nick asks his question, because I want to just make sure we're setting the table. We're all on the same playing field here. So PHP, pretty linear, right? You get a PHP file, it goes from the top down and does whatever's in that PHP file, right? an event loop is basically like a queuing service that allows us to say, hey, do this. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go do other things. And then I'm going to come back and check to see if you're done. The Revolt piece is a library that is an event loop that provides some additional services and help to your PHP to make it run more efficiently, and kind of offloads that event loop functionality to the Revolt library.
Yeah, so the library provides you with, I like to call them primitives to schedule things.
Okay.
So I think there's a few main ones in the Revolt library. One is basically saying, I have some asynchronous task. I'll start doing it. When it's done, I'll let the Revolt event loop know, and then it'll call my code again.
Yeah.
And while that's going, I run other codes.
Yep.
The other one is to say, after a certain amount of time has expired, run some kind of code. Maybe you're doing some async task which you're waiting, and you want to make sure that if that hasn't completed after 30 seconds, you run some other codes that cancels the operation and continues anyway. And then the last one that is included, which is important, is one where you can say, just repeat this task until I cancel it.
So much like Drupal, instead of writing your own kind of event loop library, like Revolt's just basically like a bag of tools for event loop handling.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No problem. So why does Drupal need one of these? What's exciting?
So we started with the hard part, which is actually the event loop, which we use for scheduling the asynchronous tasks. And Drupal doesn't really have any of those at the moment, but we're introducing some with fibers, or we have already introduced some with fibers. And this can mostly be found in, for example, BigPipe at the moment, but also in the render. When you implement this manually with fibers, you keep track of the little tasks that you know about, and you can parallelize those. And then you need to write some code that waits for those tasks that you know about to be done. And one of the things we saw when that code was first implemented is that we actually created a bunch of local loops. So, for example, BigPipe itself might know about the tasks that it is performing, and it creates some code that waits for those tasks to be done. But there might be other tasks outside of the BigPipe system that could also run in parallel that BigPipe itself doesn't know about. The same thing goes for the renderer. You can jump through a lot of hoops with fibers and then say, like, if my coordination task, as I'll call it, for BigPipe that runs the little tasks, is itself detecting that it's inside a bigger task, then at some point I need to give back control to this outer loop to make sure that the other tasks the system might want to do can continue. But that's actually a lot of boilerplate code that you would have to implement at each location where you want to implement smaller tasks. And what the event loop allows us to do is to say, on an application level, rather than every little bit of the application taking care of its own small tasks, you register the tasks you have with the event loop, and the event loop itself will make sure that all the tasks it know about get some time to continue working. And when a task says, I have nothing left to do, it'll switch over to another task. And that's, I have nothing left to do, is usually waiting for some input or output. So this could be data returning from the database. Maybe you're making an HTTP call to an external service, or you're fetching something from the cache. And that's also why under the library you have those extensions, because those are usually things where you interact with your operating system, and your operating system actually provides you with ways of getting notified about those tasks completing.
So is this primarily a performance thing? Is it going to use less memory across multiple requests? What's kind of the main, or is it just about developer experience? Like, what's the main takeaway of implementing this for core?
So it's a bit of both. I think one thing to start with is maybe why is fibers itself a big deal for PHP and also for Drupal? Because, like I said, the event loop has already existed for quite a long while, and there has actually been libraries that always did asynchronous PHP. But one of the challenges with writing codes that performs these kinds of asynchronous tasks is that your code needs to care about when the result is done. So say you fetch some external data from an API, you don't only need to care about the data that you get back as you would in synchronous code. So you just say, I use my guzzle, I fetch a JSON API endpoint, I get my JSON back, I continue. But when you call that function, it's asynchronous, you also need to care about whether that function is actually completed. So you get a sort of status result that you need to check. And this is a problem in programming that is called the what color is my function problem. Because basically for every asynchronous function that you're calling, you can now not just write your code as if you get a value back, but you have to do this state bookkeeping. And if we look at Drupal historically, it's synchronous. So if we want to convert Drupal to be asynchronous instead, then everywhere we might have some data fetching, we would have to add this results indicator. And that would mean a huge rewrite for all of the things within Drupal, all of the module code. And that's, of course, something we're never going to do. So where Fibers is really cool is that they actually saw this problem at the PHP level, and they said, okay, someone still needs to care about the fact that something is asynchronous. But with Fibers, we provide a language level fundamental or component that you can use to encapsulate that asynchronous work. And that means that for everything that is outside of the code that cares about Fibers, it can still look like synchronous code. So that is why in PHP 8.1, PHP or 8.0, I don't quite remember, Fibers was such a big deal because it allows applications to start being asynchronous while the rest of the application can still think it's dealing with synchronous code. But at that point, sorry, go for it.
No, go ahead. Finish.
At that point, you get this orchestration problem, and that is where then the event loop comes in. And because you're talking about orchestration, you want to make sure that this is only once per application. And then I'm not answering your question. I'm answering a different question. But you want to have this once in your application. So that's actually why Revolt, because the developers from these previous async libraries came together and said, we want interoperability. And this was also the person that actually proposed Fibers to the core PHP development team. And they said, okay, let's build Revolt as this orchestrator, and then everything can use that.
I have to say one thing that I do like about this, by the way, the PHP's implementation is it feels PHP is still staying sequential first or synchronous first. And I have to say, one of the biggest complaints I have about JavaScript, anytime I'm working in JavaScript, is it's asynchronous first. The amount of times I have to like stop and remember, like, the old days, async await or whatever, like all that stuff. Like it's like 90% of the time when you're writing a small function, like you just want it to be synchronous. And JavaScript, like, so you spend almost all of your time saying like, no, this explicitly needs to be synchronous. This needs to be synchronous. Whereas in PHP, your logic is you go through the logic and then afterwards you can be like, oh, you know what? This can be asynchronous. Let me explicitly tag, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about implementation, but tag it as this can be asynchronous and then let the system take care of it, which is much more valuable to me.
Yeah, for sure.
It's how humans think.
Yeah. And I sidetracked a little bit into why Fibers was cool, but your original question is like, what is this going to affect, and what is this? Why should we care? So I think in the short term, it's going to be focused mostly on the requests and the performance of single requests to Drupal. I think with BigPipe, we're laying some groundwork, which you mostly notice when you have a little BigPipe block that maybe does some asynchronous I/O. So Guzzle at the moment is really the only thing that we have that that can do asynchronous IO like that. The major shift is going to come when async database comes to Drupal. And I think this is also where we're coming to a point where we're focusing our efforts on that initiative, which I think has been going on for quite a few years already. Is going to be more and more important, because what we can say is if we have different elements on a page that are independent, we can tell the event loop, hey, I'm loading some data. And then when that data is loaded, just continue here with this other code that I'm now waiting for. And the other block can do the same, which means that essentially we can start fetching the data for both of those blocks in parallel rather than after each other. And that's going to result in performance improvements for page
They can
loads.
be cached separately too, more
Exactly.
efficiently. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think for me, the exciting part is actually the step after that, because right now, and this was also a large focus of my DrupalCon Barcelona talk. Right now, Drupal is really focused on web requests. But if we look at all the modules we have available and just the Drupal as an application framework is really nice to work with. What we can do with the event loop when we can start doing things asynchronously is also make long-running Drupal applications. An example of that for me would be, for example, a chat server. Because if you have a chat server, then you want persistent connections because you want to be able to receive data from a client. You want to be able to push data back to the client when another client adds data. So you need to hold those connections open. There is ways around that, but they're all quite tricky to do. I've implemented a different workaround a few years ago. That's not a lot of fun. But if we can do things asynchronously, then it's no longer a problem to handle multiple connections at the same time and do those different tasks because they don't get in each other's way, but they can really coordinate and cooperate to multitask.
So you're going to re-implement Drupal Slack in Drupal, basically.
I mean, you could in theory, yeah. Not sure if Slack is the right company to go after, but you could for sure. And I think that's where you get to really new types of applications that you can think about with Drupal.
Kind of opens Drupal up to being a framework for more and more things. Yeah. Interesting. So what actually has to change in core to implement this?
So one of the important milestones was actually reached on the 24th of October, and that is to get the Revolt event loop dependency into core. Drupal core is used by a lot of people, so actually getting a new dependency into core is quite an interesting process, I found out, which requires some checks and balances of, is it well maintained, is it secure, how are security issues handled if they do come up. But that was actually recently merged, so that's really cool. The very next step is that one of the challenges you get if you start introducing asynchronous tasks into an application is that your application might end before some asynchronous work that you're waiting for has completed. So you mentioned earlier that you don't really want to think about the async. You're going to have to a little bit with these primitives. But to solve that, we actually have to say, okay, at some point in the Drupal lifecycle, when we think everything that can be kicked off has been kicked off and is ready, we need to wait for any open tasks to finish and any code that needs to respond to that to respond. So that's a single line of code, which is event loop run, that we need to add in the right place within Drupal. And Catch has actually already been helping me in figuring out where in the kernel lifecycle that's best done, because you kind of want to do it before cleanup, but also not too early because then new things might happen.
So from a core standpoint, it's one really important line that's getting dropped in
Yeah.
the runtime. Okay.
And then we do need to convert the existing fibers codes, which is in BigPipe and the renderer, to use the event loop itself. But that already has an open pull request, but it has test failures. And I expect that once we know where to put event loop run in the Drupal kernel, then we can also solve those test failures and get that conversion going.
So, I mean, I see the value, right? Event loops, like, okay, they allow you to like move faster, right? But they also add complexity, right? Because as you said earlier, like, hey, something doesn't finish, the application finishes, like now there's like unfinished stuff that you may or may not need. Code has to be updated to kind of be aware of that and say, hey, like, go check to make sure this thing's done before you move on to the next step, right? So there's like, to me, being like an, I don't know, not an outsider, but like being like a non-developer, we'll say, right? Looking at this, I'm like, what problem does this actually solve? Is it just like, hey, we're getting minute performance improvements in the code? Is it like, hey, developers think this is cool because it's like it's allowing for these kind of small improvements? Is there some like future possibilities that this opens the Drupal ecosystem up to? Like, I'm just wondering, like, are we overcomplicating adding this, or is it really solving a problem?
So I think we're seeing from work that was already ongoing that there is a desire to be able to do more things in parallel. I think, for example, the batch API might be a really good example where you can have a lot of tasks that are now happening one after the other, where usually you're performing some repetitive task on the same thing. And you could also say, okay, rather than doing one after the other, I start doing some of those together. You have to think about memory constraints, things like that, but that would
Sure.
be an option. And we already saw this with some of the things that were being converted to fibers in Drupal core, where there were tangible performance benefits of breaking tasks up that we were now doing one after the other and doing them in parallel. When you start parallelizing things like that using fibers, then the problem you run into is this coordination problem of making sure that all of the code in my application actually gets a chance to run, and that I'm not waiting for one set of asynchronous tasks while I could be working on others. And that is where the event loop comes in to say, okay, we need a single place to do this scheduling and organizing all of our tasks so that we make sure that none of them are forgotten and we create new bottlenecks.
I wonder. So you explained that perfectly. Like, it makes sense to me. Like, okay, like obviously, if we can do things faster, that's better. If we're aware of like hardware and resource constraints, like that's obviously good because we can we plan accordingly to that. One thing that comes to mind though, like, are we jumping into like the the quagmire that was like moving to OOP, right? Like, there's a shift from what the way Drupal used to code, right, to like moving to object oriented, right? And people are like, you're changing things on me. Like, are we kind of like gonna see that sort of mentality where people are like, oh, now you're using this event loop and now I gotta like build my code to like look at the event loop to make sure things finished the way that they're supposed to?
I hope not. So the idea of the event loop is that you don't really need to care about it unless you are the one doing asynchronous tasks.
Got it.
Yeah, it'll be transparent, right? For
Yeah.
most developers.
Yeah.
Got it.
So
Okay.
so if you're the person, so I think even, for example, the way I see it is if you were using the entity API, you probably won't know this is a thing because you just say, I want to load my entity. And the entity API is smart enough to say, okay, well, I need to go make a database call. So I register this task on the event loop. And then I can do other things in the meantime. And once it's done, thanks to fibers, we'll continue executing where we just stopped. And basically your function will still look synchronous. So you don't need to care about the status. You just get your value back from the entity
So
API.
it's self-contained in core, basically, where it's like, hey, we're just going to do our thing and we're going to move faster now because we're using an event loop, and you're not going to really care because we're going to get you the data that you need, or the information that you need. Got it.
So where you might care is, say you're implementing your own block that needs to pull data from 5 different websites.
Right.
At that point, you might say, okay, I'm going to interact with the event loop because I want to register that I'm doing these 5 things. I need them to complete before I can continue. But by pushing them onto the event loop and then saying, okay, I'm going to wait for my tasks to be done, you're giving the event loop the chance, while your block is fetching data, to do other things like fetch that entity data or rather render different page elements.
Will the core Drupal API be extended to like include an API for interacting with this library, or like how is that going to look?
So at the API of the library is pretty small. So I would expect that for those people that care, you can interact with the library directly.
Got it.
And beyond that, so for example, in BigPipe, we have certain tasks of fetching data and doing something with the data that will need to be converted to actually use the event loop. Similar for the render, I think the cache warmer API is another candidate where it's not asynchronous yet, but will be likely made asynchronous in the future.
Right.
Those kinds of places that are really doing low-level tasks that need to be scheduled will need to care about the event loop. But I can imagine, for example, the HTTP client or, like I said, the entity API or the database API, they will do the data fetching tasks themselves, and you will just keep using the APIs that you're using.
Got it.
And that's also why I think it's exciting, is because for the most part, we can introduce this transparently. And that is, if we're still talking about fetching data within one request, I think that's quite transparent. Where it's going to be more noticeable for developers is when we want to take Drupal beyond those web requests and really move to different types of applications. Because then you're going to have problems that are inherent to long-running applications. Like, how do you work with your static cache in memory and make sure that those things get invalidated properly if another long-running instance of your application changes it?
Okay. You've convinced me. I will now get off my grumpy old developer, get off my lawn talk track, and we can ask more positive questions.
So we've talked about a couple of areas where this will be helpful with BigPipe and the render cache, like things that are already kind of asynchronous. But the first thing that I thought of as the piece that I interact with most often as a site, Drupal website builder / developer is cron. And so I think there's 2 parts to this question. One is this going to allow cron to be truly parallel? Like, one of the problems that you run into cron, especially if you're indexing items for search in cron, is that you just run out of time. Can we use this to really parallelize that? And then can some of those tasks, like a reindex, for example, can that just be a long, almost like a CLI command? Are you able to initiate? I guess my question is, does this allow you to essentially initiate a long running command as if it were a CLI command? So it'll just run until it completes? Or
So,
no?
I understand. I understand what you want to ask. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. So, the event loop itself does not change how you would run a command like that. So basically, if we look at cron, for example, then I'm assuming you're using something like drush core cron as a command on the command line. And drush is the thing that makes bootstrapping Drupal in application possible and have that long running thing. What for the indexing example, what happens right now is that I'm saying, okay, index this item. When it's done, index the next item, then it's done. What fibers together with an event loop can do is to say, just index all of these items, just send them to either your database or to Solr, and then wait for them to be done. If those are all independent tasks, then you can parallelize the parts where IO needs to happen.
Oh.
So that would condense that.
So it goes a layer below that to split up the tasks. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Does this, I guess the corollary then, the other place where I interact with kind of long running tasks that could be parallels like this sometimes is like batches. Like, do you see this having an impact on kind of the batch API and core? Can that be set up?
I think it's for all of those kind of tasks. It's if they're currently IO constraints. So if the bottleneck is fetching data or pushing data, because we can still we're still constrained to running one bit of PHP code at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're now spending time waiting for something to come back from the database or from some other external service, then while we're doing that waiting, we can do other tasks. And that's where the speed up is going to come from.
Okay. So if you have a task that needs to get some data from somewhere else and then do something and then write something in a database, it could be right now it has to get it, wait for it, calculate it, then put it in the database. But with this new parallel with Revolt event loop, it can get something while it's calculating, you start getting the next one and right to the database. So you're kind of like overlapping them a little bit, but you're still constrained to the amount of writes to the database you can do at one time or something, right?
Yeah. So basically it would you would fetch your first piece of data, then you don't have any data yet, so you would wait for that. You would say, okay, just start fetching the next piece of data and I'll process this first piece of data. Then basically while you're doing something with that first piece of data, your code is running and nothing else is happening. But in the background, the operating system is fetching that data. And then once you're done processing, you say, okay, kick off the write. Now I have nothing to do until the write is complete. And then because you previously started fetching that data, the event loop can say, okay, well, you said what you wanted to do when the data was fetched. So now we can start doing that while that write is ongoing. And that's how you're condensing the steps essentially.
And you have to define each of those steps manually as a task or something, or do you just kind of kick it off to the event loop and it figures out which pieces it can parallelize?
If you have those kind of tasks, then you would have to do that manually for the event loop. So that is actually, so there are libraries that make this easier for you. One of the big ones, they're actually like libraries of collections with different packages for different types of tasks. The big ones are mPHP and React PHP. And the reason why with Drupal we're adopting the Revolt event loop is because the maintainers of those libraries came together and said, like, look, we both currently have our own event loop, but they are not compatible. So we need one that we can both use. And that's where they made Revolt, which means that you can pick whichever of those libraries works best for your use case. And within Contrib, you might use one of those to say, okay, I need to run 30 things in parallel. Take the, I don't know if this is the right name, but the mPHP parallel package. And then that'll give you some helpers to deal with fetching data, processing the data, saving the data.
Got it.
Just out of curiosity here, we're talking about like milliseconds of time, right? Because we're saying like, hey, it's going to save you time, but it's not like it's not like, hey, it's going to save you minutes. It's like we're talking milliseconds of time, but obviously those milliseconds add up over the course of like the running of bootstrapping or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. But I think the different kinds of things that we can do might be more complex. So for me, an interesting use case is the GraphQL API. which like I'm a co-maintainer of the GraphQL module. And one of the things that is actually inherent in the specification for GraphQL is how to resolve a request. And it basically starts layer by layer. So in a GraphQL request, you specify fields, and that field might return a complex object for which you can further select fields. And you can do this very deeply down a tree. And what the GraphQL specification says is basically those fields on the second layer are independent from the fields on the top layer, because the top layer likely returns different kind of objects. In Drupal currently, we need to basically fetch every field one after another, and we can do some smart things to make sure we sort of do this layer by layer. But if we move to fibers and to the event loop, we can parallelize that much more. So there, because our main task is fetching data, the speed up is much more pronounced. Also because that is very well suited for doing this kind of parallel data fetching.
Good to know.
Yeah, I mean, that's you basically answered my question I was going to ask next, which was what impact would this change have on contrib? And what you just described is, a couple different contrib modules that would be able to change the way that they're able to fetch things. That's interesting, the GraphQL example, because I'd mostly been thinking about this from a PHP and rendering and big pipe and all that, but it actually could have an impact on headless as well as what you're describing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for contrib, where a large impact might not be directly for how you use the tool, but for example, for Drush, currently it needs to jump through a lot of hoops to bootstrap Drupal, because Drupal is kind of expecting that it'll be in a request. And I hope also that when people see the kind of things they can build when Drupal becomes more async, is that maybe some of those aspects of Drupal always needing a request become more optional, so that tools like Drush will be better supported. And I think other parts might be things like Behat. So Behat is a testing tool that we use within OpenSocial, and it allows you to write tests in a human language. And then what the current implementation for Behat does, which the community uses, is it also bootstraps Drupal, and then it'll use Drupal APIs to set up data for those kind of tests. And right now, we also really need to do that one test at a time, or we need to make sure we isolate like physical different databases for different tests to make parallelization possible. But I think here as well, if you have setup steps that need to create a large amount of data, or maybe tests that test entirely different things, you might be able to run them in parallel, because while they're waiting for some IO, the other tests can already start running. And I think when you get into this, it's a bit abstract, but I think especially within the realm of websites, most of the time we spend waiting is for some form of IO. Because we're not making applications that are doing scientific calculations where you're really bound by the speed of your processor. Then hopefully you're not using PHP. But most of the work we do is reading a Twig file, maybe converting it to a PHP class, fetching some data from the database, running that data through a little bit of code to output HTML, and then sending it back to the clients.
I think this could also have an impact on things like config import too, right? Because I imagine the config manager could detect like individual separate dependency trees and then just like import them in parallel, right? Like if one of them is waiting, it can import a different one. I mean, I don't want to be the one to write that, to convert that to a full event loop, but
Yeah.
I feel like between that and recipes, that would have probably a huge impact on performance, perceived performance. Now I think it's not something that we do all that often nowadays, but I think as recipes become more mature, it'll become more common to apply them. So seeing that speed up would be, would be good.
Yeah, I think that's
That'd
a
be a
good
great thing.
example. Anywhere where you read a lot of files, like that can all be basically you just tell the file system load as many files in parallel as possible, and whenever a file is loaded, I need to start building this dependency tree. And then if I have something for which dependencies are satisfied, I push it to the database, and then I continue to the next task. Absolutely.
I wonder, we've been talking a little bit about databases, right? And I wonder, does this open up the possibility of, you know, Drupal being compatible with different types of databases, or the ability to maybe investigate different database compatibility options?
I think not directly.
Hmm.
So what I have tried already, AmpPHP has an async MySQL package,
Hmm.
which you can pull in, and then you can run asynchronous queries on the event loop, use them to coordinate them. I've tried implementing this with Drupal, but Drupal's database APIs are very complex, and I've seen, like, in trying to do that, there's been many great improvements made by the work that was being done to try and support MongoDB, like moving all the database drivers to modules. That made it a lot easier to experiment with. But I think most of the, at least from my point of view, and I'm not a database maintainer at all, so people might disagree, but from my point of view, the difficulty of working with different databases might not necessarily be in the connection to the database, but it's actually in making sure that all of the APIs that Drupal provides and all of the guarantees about how to work with revisions and fields and things like that, that those keep working and work consistently across um, different databases.
Yeah.
But I think
I
if
think you're right.
yeah, if we can solve that challenge, then this does open up saying, okay, let's take that maybe package from AMP, async MySQL, and then we don't need to worry about how we integrate with PHP's asynchronous database extension.
Yeah. That'd be interesting. I'm curious to hear what was the genesis of this initiative, because it feels like this is something that you kind of took on yourself and have been championing for a while. I've been seeing you, pushing in the issue queue, and I think can contribute. Was it a particular project? Was it the chat application? But like, what made you think that this is something that Drupal core, it's worth the effort to get this dependency, and it's worth the effort to convert some of this stuff? What was the genesis of that?
So the chat application has been a few years ago. And for that I wrote like a really separate application to translate between Drupal and have the asynchronous part that could keep the connections open. And that was built on React PHP. So that was my introductions to these kinds of concepts.
Mhm.
I think I stumbled a little bit upon Revolt when looking at what was happening around fibers. And then what really pushed this for me was that I saw Catch doing pushing the transformation from synchronous to asynchronous using fibers. And I think when I saw that happening, I was like, okay, that's really cool. Like there are these use cases even for Drupal core, and I think also for Drupal contrib. And quite quickly, I spotted the problem while reviewing the code you wrote of saying, hey, this works asynchronously locally, but it doesn't work asynchronously in a larger application. And then we actually rewrote the codes to say, okay, if we're in a larger asynchronous part, then take that into account and make sure we also hand off control. But that actually looks quite complex. And I know from working with React PHP previously, that can actually be much simpler if we don't have to think about that scheduling. And that's when I thought, okay, well, it would be really cool if I could use those kind of libraries like React PHP and MPHP that I've used before, which I know can do some cool things on top of Drupal core. And that requires having the event loop. So the event loop really is there to say, okay, as Drupal, we're adopting this standard that the PHP community is also rallying around. And then if you have a library that is compatible with that, you can use it within Drupal to do async stuff.
I think as we're talking through this, I think I have one concern, and hopefully you can allay these fears. But I think, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I think one of the bigger problems with anything asynchronous is it can be difficult to track down where the issue is, and they tend to particularly crop up in things like tests. So we talked about like it would be good for tests because we could parallelize some of it, make it even better and make it faster. But I mean, night watch tests are asynchronous tests, and I would say probably 30 to 40% of the time on any issue that you're testing, you have to rerun the night watch tests. Is there any Do you think that this has the possibility of making tests more likely to fail just due to asynchronous weirdness? Or do you think the Revolt team, because it's a team behind Revolt, right? It's not like that's like a company or something, or
No,
like a
there's
like a sort of,
there's the maintainers of MPHP,
okay,
and
so
they work
it's a
together with,
project though.
yeah,
Like so,
yeah.
okay. Like I imagine they've solved some of these issues, but is there going to be some sort of guardrail to make sure that we're not introducing, or like layout builder, the layout builder test? I don't know how often that fails. Like I feel like I see that once every 10 runs. It just like if you rerun it, it passes, and nobody knows why. Is there any danger of that cropping up more from this, or is it kind of handled in a way that that's not a concern at all?
I think so. So instability in tests usually comes from randomness, and I think one of the challenges if you start moving fully to async is that um, things might run in different orders, and that is a part of randomness that tests can fail on. Um, I think in the short term, I don't necessarily see this being a problem, but I cannot make promises for the long term. I
Yeah.
think um, I think asynchronous applications are inherently more complex than synchronous
Yeah.
applications because you, like you said at the beginning, you can read through a synchronous application and see exactly what it does. But I also think asynchronous applications are more powerful than synchronous applications, and there's things we can do that we otherwise cannot do. So it's a trade-off we're making. I think the Revolt event loop has some tools to help debug what is happening. I think it contains like a debugging runner that prints out when it does things or makes it easy to implement something like that. I also know that Fibers itself has been written in a way to be pretty good with providing you the call stack of where things have happened, which used to be a big problem, especially in Node.js, because you would lose any context from where the task is coming from. That is currently I tested this after I got a question from someone in the community, and I tested this in Xdebug, and there it was having trouble with providing the full call stack for where the fiber came from. But I filed a bug report that I think is still open.
Yeah.
And I would expect, given how prevalent fibers are becoming in the PHP community as a whole, I would expect the tooling to improve there as well.
I want to be clear that even with this caveat, I think it's worth it, right? I think the power that this, first of all, I think it's going to be transparent to like 90% of developers, 95% of developers. But I'm of the opinion that the kind of power that this provides, the flexibility this provides for the type of applications that you can build, like strictly in Drupal, that you can't do today without some sort, really bending over backwards in some sort of headless architecture, is worth it. I think it's valuable. So even if that the answer had been yes, there will be something like that. I don't think that that's reason not to, because there's also concerns about security. Like you said, the security team did a thorough review and they have to figure out that chain. But whenever you move asynchronous, there's additional, I don't want to say surface, but like it's a new way of thinking about that the security team has to get used to, right? And so I'm sure they're doing their research and due diligence, and they're aware of like some of the big things, but it's different, right? It's different when things can execute out of order or not complete. So, but again, I don't think that those concerns are worth having, worth discussing. I'm not advocating that those are concerns that would be worth derailing or stopping progress in this case, because they're essentially solve problems. They're just something that the Drupal community has to learn.
Now Nick's getting on the grumpy developer soapbox.
That's so good.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I don't want to over promise what this can do. I think it's really exciting, but it's for sure a new skill that if people think they have use cases, and there were some very enthusiastic responses at DrupalCon, then I think it is a skill and a mental model worth learning.
So could you give us the argument for why the Revolt event loop specifically is the correct way to go? What makes it the most reliable solution? Why would we choose this package to be a dependency to core? Because, every new dependency to core, we're relying on that, giant stack, right? So what's the argument? Why are we going for this one?
So the first question I got when I tried to introduce Revolt was, why can't this live in Contrib? And the answer to that is you need one per application, because otherwise you get scheduling conflicts. So that is why we need one at all. Then the next one is why would Drupal not implement this itself? Because in theory, it is not very complex. It's a loop somewhere in your application that keeps track of tasks and calls tasks that are complete. The problem is every bit of code in your application that wants to do something asynchronously needs to know how the event loop works and wants to schedule things on the event loop. So you need something that has compatibility, ideally with code outside of Drupal. Because while asynchronous PHP is new to Drupal, it's definitely not new to the PHP community. The Revolt event loop was built as a collaboration between these large async PHP packages, so React PHP and MPHP. And it's also maintained by the person who was part of driving Fibers adoption within PHP itself. So from having someone that understands how Fibers works, making sure that you immediately get access to these large ecosystems of async tools that you can explore for your own contrib code. I think that's why Revolt is the right choice for compatibility, and because it's made by people with knowledge about the subject.
Also gets us off the Drupal island a little bit
Exactly.
more, right? Like I'm a big fan of like, hey, if those guys are worried about like their specific use case and their specific thing, like we can benefit from that. We can share back to that. But like now we don't have to kind of take on that additional effort to kind of roll our own and build our own thing. That makes complete sense. So one thing as I was sitting here listening to you guys that came to mind was Dries's DrupalCon Barcelona Dries note, right, where we kind of unveiled this integration with API with AI, excuse me, and AI's ability to like run a chat bot. And then here you are talking about a chatbot, and I'm wondering, like, could this, help with the interaction or evolution of AI within Drupal?
So I think where it helps is the I/O part.
Sure.
I think calling AI is generally something that on the AI side requires a bit of processing power, and for us, what you can do with async Drupal and the event loop is to say, okay, I'm going to kick off that call to OpenAI or my own large language model. And while I'm waiting for that to return, let me just start doing other things. And what those other things are, that's up to the application
But
developer.
it could also be a case where you say, hey, Drupal AI, create me a content type with these, 6 fields doing this stuff, right? And like it goes off and does that in a loop in the background, and then you're still interacting with the AI chatbot to do other things, right?
Yeah, you would have to change the model of how Drupal runs, because so I think for that chatbot, while the interaction is a chatbot, I think if you write a message, it's a separate web request
I see.
to the server. So you're already kind of getting that parallelization by the fact that you're sending multiple requests from your browser.
I want to actually really quickly. This is such a dumb pun. I want to loop back to my question about.
Oh, all right. Good night, everybody. We're done here.
I want to go back really quickly to my cron question, because I forgot that this was an issue, because I now always just use like whatever system cron I'm on and Drush to run it. So users almost never actually just hit it. But there is an issue where if cron is scheduled to happen and it hasn't started yet, the person who visits the web page next, the lucky person to visit the website before that happens, gets a very, 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 very long page load, because cron has to finish running before the page loads. Can we use Revolt event loop to kind of invert that, where it's like, hey, if a page request would trigger a cron run, schedule it, give them the page, then trigger the cron run in the background on that request, or no?
So it depends a bit on why that page needed to wait for cron in the first place. If there's tasks that you absolutely need to complete before that page can be shown, then this should happen first. I think so. Let me I don't know if I can answer your question directly, but I can give a counter example that might.
Sure.
One of the things that Catch was working on was the cache pre-warm API, which is to say that when a new deployment of a site is done, all the caches are emptied. Before we can show a page, there is a certain amount of work that we need to do. And this currently happens one after the other. What that API is trying to do is to say, okay, there's a few independent tasks, so let's all kick them off, and then we run one task until it's encountering some IO, and when it's waiting for IO, we start on the second task until that encounters some IO, and then we look at whether we can do the first task again, and that allows us to do that cache pre-warming at the same time. I think that API goes a step further, where it says even if the current request doesn't need some kind of cache that can be pre-warmed, while the request itself is not doing anything, so maybe it is waiting for data to show the page, we can kick off one of those pre-warmable tasks and run that in the background. So that's gonna, so that's going to be as the API is going to be built first, and then it's now split out to make it async later. And I think for cron that might be similar, where if some data is needed for your request, then your request is going to run into it. You'll have to calculate it or do it or whatever. But what you can do is that if your request is waiting for something and it has like spare time, then you could perform a task that might normally be performed in cron.
Sounds good. And I just wanted to clarify, the reason why I've been thinking about cron so much recently is because Birdir he's been working on an issue for a long time to kind of revamp the cron system in Drupal in general, and he's been interacting with some of the object-oriented hook work that we've been doing, just kind of like investigating that. And so it's kind of top of mind as we were talking about this. It's not that I generally spend most of my development time thinking about cron and how it executes its task, but I was curious about that.
So for me, long term, I would actually like to get rid of cron instead, because where we come to, if we move to the stage where we can build these different types of applications, these long running types of applications, and that's quite a way away, because then you need to start thinking about services not keeping global states inside of their class, because you might be calling a service with one task, then while that task is waiting for some IO, some other task might call that same service. So the service really needs to be stateless. And that's going to be a longer term switch for the community.
Yeah.
But if we get there, one of the things you can do, instead of having cron that runs every 5 minutes, you just set up a second application that listens to some kind of message bus like Kafka or RabbitMQ or maybe even Redis. And then whenever your web server says like, oh, I have a new task, like something needs to be indexed, just push it onto the message bus. That can be done asynchronously, so that doesn't need to block your request. And then your long running application just sits there and says like, oh, I get a new task. I need to index something. I index it and I continue. And then you don't need to have cron to do things every 5 minutes, because you can do tasks when they become available, or schedule them to happen on some time within your application itself.
Makes sense.
Breaking here, cron may not be a thing in the future. No, we'll see. I mean, maybe that could be cool.
I think cron will stay, because we also don't want to push the different hosting requirements for long running applications onto everyone. But I think getting Drupal to a place where both are possible, and contrib modules just say, I have a task to process, and your application decides whether that happens every 5 minutes with cron, whether that happens continuously with a long running application, or maybe even without cron in the background of a request. That would be a cool place to end up.
That would be pretty cool. Alexander, thanks for joining us again. Awesome, amazing, enlightening topic. Very, very excited to see how this progresses in the future.
You're welcome. Yeah, I hope even without a whiteboard and visual aids, it was clear enough for everyone.
The way I usually gauge it is like, if I understand it, then like I think all of our listeners will be fine. So I think we got there.
That's good.
All right. Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that big Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All righty. Alex, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, talk about event loops or open social, how could they go about doing that?
So I always hang out in the Drupal Slack, also in the Talking Drupal channel. You can also find my website, alexanderfarweg.com. It's not had a lot of love recently, but I am trying to bring it onto Drupal. It's currently not Drupal. I hope I complete that somewhere this year. And from there, you can also find all the other places you can find me.
Fabulous. Josh, what about you?
Yeah, I'm Joshua Wami on Drupal.org and on Drupal Slack. I also blog infrequently at joshuawami.com.
Awesome. Nick?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks, as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.